The American Civil War was a conflict that divided the nation into two halves, the North versus the South, the Union versus the Confederacy. But yet during this conflict things weren't quite as black and white, or blue and grey as you might imagine, and indeed people from many different nations around the world took part in the fighting rather than just Americans. And in today's video I'd like to look particularly at what the German connection was with the American Civil War. Some 216,000 people who had been born in Germany fought for the North during the Civil War, while a number around the low thousands fought for the South. That means that around 10% of the Union's fighting force, the North's fighting force, had actually been born in what is today Germany. Now, around 250,000 of those who fought for the North were second-generation German immigrants. And so that means that taken together, first and second-generation Germans fighting for the North made up around a quarter of the entire of the North's fighting force during the American Civil War. In fact, for New York alone, around 10 regiments were entirely ethnically German, with many more being drawn from various areas around the country. Germans saw combat on all of the fronts of the American Civil War and fought on both sides and in various different roles. And in today's video, I'd like to take a bit of a closer look at what the German involvement in the American Civil War actually was. It's worth looking a little bit at German immigration into the United States in the years leading up to the war. It's also important to note that there wasn't actually a country called Germany yet at this time, although there was a concept of Germanness. Basically anyone who spoke German could constitute, and there were many different states in what is today Germany, Austria, and certain other countries in the surrounding areas. An important event for the Germans in the American Civil War are the revolutions of 1848, which sprang up through many countries in Europe at the time, including the German-speaking countries, and which clamoured for a German state to emerge. However, these revolutions were largely unsuccessful, particularly in the German-speaking countries, and this prompted a wave of migrants fleeing from the authoritarian crackdowns on these liberal revolutionaries. Many of these, between 1841 and 1860, would end up in the United States of America, and between these years, over 1,386,293 registered German speakers entered the United States. These had a certain name. They were called the 48er, or in English, the 48ers, those basically fleeing the repercussions of the 1848 revolutions and coming to America. They came to certain parts of the United States in larger numbers than others. Almost all of them came through the port of New York, and that's where a very large German-speaking community would remain. Others would go further into the interior, particularly into areas of the Midwest, where there still are many people of German ancestry and some who still speak German to this day. This is very important, this ideological background, because it meant that those German immigrants coming to the United States had particular views on liberalism and the rights of man. And one important early advocate was Hermann Raster, who is considered one of the 48ers who had arrived in the United States and in 1856 became a presidential elector, being a very key component in what drove many German Americans to start supporting the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. German Americans being very likely indeed to vote Republican and are part of the reason why he was elected in the first place. German Turnvereine, or in English, gymnastics societies, were organized societies of German men who became very Republican in their outlook, and who would form basis of the first Union militias. Indeed, these Turnervereinigung would be responsible for security both at the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln and 4 years later at his funeral. These German political organizations, often set up by 48ers, were very involved in the politics leading up to the American Civil War, and when Civil War broke out, they enlisted in large numbers in the Union Army. Already in 1861, at the very outbreak of war, Germans were actively mobilizing across the country. One place where this was rather controversial was the border state of Missouri, which hadn't actually signed the secession of the South and also had not committed to the North but attempted to remain neutral. Nevertheless, pro-Union militia made up mostly of ethnic Germans was formed in St. Louis, and they attempted to take prisoner some 700 pro-secessionist militia that had been gathering and attempted to steal arms. This was done successfully and they wanted to bring them back into the city, but a largely pro-secessionist crowd gathered around them and started hurling insults at them, such as "damn the Dutch." And the reason why they're talking about Dutch and not Germans, I explain in this video. It's a long-standing linguistic faux pas in the English-speaking world, confusing the Dutch and the Germans or the Deutsch. But anyway, they weren't just hurling insults. At one point, one of the protesters pulled out a pistol and killed one of the militiamen, prompting the militia to fire into the crowd. This resulted in the deaths of some 28 people. And in the following days, rioting would break loose in St. Louis, largely targeting the ethnic German community, with a lot of inter-ethnic violence occurring. For more about this, check out my video on Germans in the United States. One of the most important figures in the German-American community at the time was Franz Sigel. He had also been one of the 48ers, and he was a strong supporter of President Abraham Lincoln. That's why in 1861, Lincoln appointed him to the rank of Brigadier General and gave him a field command. It's fair to say that Sigel, although he was a great organizer of men and important in bringing Germans to the cause of the Union, was not a great general. And he would fight in several engagements in 1861, losing almost all of them, and that gave him somewhat of a reputation as being an inept general. Nevertheless, in 1862, he was promoted to Major General. This was probably a political decision because he was so good in bringing German Americans into the Union cause and having them sign up into regiments. He was put in charge of largely ethnic German units. And this led to a slogan which was "I goes to fight mit Sigel," which basically exemplified this idea that in the German community they often signed up explicitly because Sigel was in such a high position and they wanted to serve with fellow German speakers. Another interesting character who was also a former 48er was Karl Schurz. Karl Schurz had come over from the Rhineland, and in 1862 he had enlisted and persuaded Abraham Lincoln to give him a commission as a brigadier general, although later he would be promoted again to major general. Karl Schurz would lead the X-1 Corps, or the 6th Corps, at various battles, including the Battle of Chancellorsville, which would be somewhat controversial because there is still a disagreement as to the outcome of the battle, whether it was the fault of Schurz or his fellow officer Howard. In any case, the Union Army and the German units within it broke and ran from the field of battle, something that occurred again under his command at the Battle of Gettysburg, which, despite ending up as a Union victory and one of the decisive points of the American Civil War, still saw the German units under his command break and run. Not all ethnic Germans who served at the Battle of Chancellorsville would come away with such a bad reputation. One of these was Hubert Dilger. Dilger had been born in the German princely state of Baden and had served in the horse artillery of Baden, coming over to the United States to become part of the 1st Battery of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery. He had experience in Europe and had had good training in artillery, unlike many of the other officers in these kinds of regiments. So at the Battle of Chancellorsville, while the infantry was caught completely by surprise by Jackson's steady advance, he managed to limber up his artillery and to rain fire down upon the advancing Confederates, stalling the advance for some time and driving the Confederates off the turnpike. This had required quite a lot of personal bravery, and in 1893 this was recognized by the state and Dilger was awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation quoted, "Fought his guns until the enemy were upon him. Then, with one gun hauled in the road by hand, he formed the rear guard and kept the enemy at bay by the rapidity of his fire and was the last man in the retreat." This no doubt was a crucial moment in the battle which gave the Union some time to form up, and it's thought that if he hadn't had done this, then the loss of the Union at the Battle of Chancellorsville may have been even greater. This and other actions throughout the Civil War would lead to him getting the nickname of Leather Breeches. Nevertheless, despite the fact that he had fought back and several other Germans and German units had fought with bravery at this battle and at Gettysburg, the reputation was sealed in 1863, and this actually led to some anti-German rioting, particularly in the larger cities of New York, because it was perceived that the Germans had behaved poorly at these battles and had broken and run. So who were these German units that were being shamed after these battles, and more broadly, which units were fighting for the Union that were largely made up of Germans? Well, most Germans actually served sort of interspersed in units that weren't entirely ethnic German but had many Germans inside them. There were some special units that were entirely German, however. the most famous being the 52nd New York, the 9th Ohio, the 74th Pennsylvania, the 32nd Indiana, the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and the 9th Wisconsin. There were many different attitudes that Union soldiers, their comrades, had towards these ethnic Germans. One thing that often came out was that they were 48ers, and so they were more politically motivated perhaps than other soldiers fighting for the Union at the time. Many German Americans were avid Republicans and supporters of Abraham Lincoln, and so they saw this oftentimes as a political crusade. The liberal values, of course, with the rights of man and their own struggle for liberalism back in Europe, meant that they were largely opposed to the hierarchical South. At the same time, there were some similar motivations with other immigrant groups that fought in the American Civil War for the Union, such as many of the Irish, who, following a successful defeat of the South and a stronger United States, hoped that they might then influence the political situation back home. This is something that many Germans, particularly 48ers, also hoped, thinking that perhaps with United States backing, they might be able to implement changes and have a more successful series of revolutions, unlike in 1848. The German units were also very much famous for their ability in terms of their discipline and their drill. Of course, the Prussian army was very famous for this with their Prussian drill, and indeed many of those Germans who were serving in units in the Union army had before been in various armed services of the various German states, including in various Prussian army units too, which was a great help for this drill and discipline. What's interesting too is that many of their compatriots and many of their comrades in the Union Army noted the German troops as often being very musical and often being those that went singing into battle. Some of these songs have been preserved, like this one, which is called I'm Going to Fight mit Siegel, which is a kind of mix mash of German and English, sort of in the idea that this was the German soldiers who were explaining their reasoning for fighting along with Franz Siegel in their broken English. It's quite interesting to read the text and have a listen, so I'll put a link to that in the description below. But anyway, that covers a little bit of the German contribution to the Union Army, but let's take a look at some of those Germans that ended up fighting for the Confederates. Now, as I already mentioned, because of the nature and area in which German immigrants settled in the United States, the vast majority of Germans would go on to fight for the Union. In fact, this isn't just a matter of geography, but also a matter of the kind of ideology, with many Germans being very fervently abolitionist, anti-slavery, and anti-oppression of any kind because of their experiences in Europe in the 1848 revolutions. However, there were some areas in the South where Germans did settle and did play a role. For example, Texas had a large German-speaking community, and slightly further north in the disputed Missouri area, there were also Germans. Most of the Germans that would end up making a name for themselves fighting for the South, however, would be those that actually came specifically from Germany at the start of the Civil War to take part in the fighting. It's worth noting then that the type of men that signed up from German backgrounds to fight for the Confederacy was often quite different to those fighting for the Union, and certainly the most famous accounts are those adventurers, often that came over from Prussia to fight in the cavalry, members of the old aristocracy, who you might describe as soldiers of fortune. This is a description of what one of them looked like in the fray. This is of Baron von Massau, who was described in 1861 as having a long red-lined cape was thrown back from his shoulders, exposing his glittering uniform. From his hat waved a big ostrich plume, and he dashed into the fray with an old German saber flashing in the light. One exception to this is Johann Andreas Wagner, who would emigrate to South Carolina and found the aptly named town of Valhalla in South Carolina. Interesting to note about Johann Andreas Wagner is that after living in the United States for several years, he changed his first name to John to make it sound more American. You'll note that this is similar to what several Dutch soldiers did after fighting for the Union forces in the American Civil War, in that they made their Dutch names sound more Americanized because of this shared experience. Now, Wagner would go on to lead the 1st South Carolina Artillery, which is important because they took part in the very first engagement of the American Civil War at the taking of Fort Sumter by Southern troops. Following the Civil War, he would be made a brigadier general, and in 1871 he would become the mayor of Charlestown. Another German was Adolphus Heimann, who had come from serving in the Prussian army. He had fought for several different armies following this. In 1846, he made his way to the United States to fight on the American side in the Mexican-American War. In 1862, he enlisted to fight for the Confederates. Heimann joined with the Provisional Army of Tennessee and would fight under Brigadier General Foster, fighting in the Western Campaign. At the Battle of Fort Henry, he would, however, be wounded and taken prisoner by Union forces, and he would be interned in a prisoner of war camp in the north, where he became gravely ill and would die several months later, being released just before his death. A fellow Prussian, and perhaps the most famous German to fight on the side of the Confederacy, was Heros von Borke. Von Borke, who had been born in the Rhine province, emigrated to the United States after a long and distinguished career in the Prussian military, serving first in the Prussian cavalry in the Garde Cuirassiers. Later on, he would also fight in the Second War of Italian Independence, again with the cavalry. In 1862, he crossed over and ran the Union blockade to join Confederate forces and was assigned to fight under the cavalry commander G.E.B. Stuart. He became known by the nickname of the Giant in Grey, partially because he stood around 6'5" in height and had a huge cavalry sword, or Solingen sword, which made him famous on the battlefield. He soon impressed his commanding officers, G.E.B. Stuart writing about his Prussian officer that Captain Heros von Borke, a Prussian cavalry officer who lately ran the blockade, assigned me by the Honourable Secretary of War, joined in the charge of the 1st Squadron in gallant style, and subsequently by his energy, skill and activity won the praise and admiration of all. Interestingly enough, this describes his actions at the Battle of Chancellorsville, so he stood on the other side where the Union fighting German troops were seen to have done poorly. This Prussian officer was seen to have done well. He would be wounded in action later in the war at the Battle of Middelburg, a few months after having been made a major in 1863, and he would be out of action until 1864, when he would resume his service fighting under Jeb Stuart until his commander's death at the Battle of Yellow Tavern. Following the war, he would return to Europe and return to the Prussian cavalry, fighting with distinction in the Austro-Prussian War, starting the year after the end of the American Civil War in 1866. The last of these Germans I'd like to look at is Augustus Büchel, who himself had a very long and distinguished military career, having taken him across the world before fighting in the American Civil War. Despite being a Prussian, he had actually been educated in the French way of fighting at the French Military Academy in Paris. He then signed up to the French Foreign Legion, where he fought during the Carlist Wars in the monarchic conflicts there. Following this, he would take a sabbatical over in the Ottoman Empire, training Ottoman soldiers for Ali Pasha. However, because he was a Christian, the highest rank he could attain there was colonel, and so he left again, this time to the United States, to sign up to fight during the Mexican-American War. He briefly returned to Europe in the 1850s to fight in the Crimean War. I couldn't find on which side he was fighting, but I think he was probably fighting against his former masters, against the Ottomans, but he would return to the United States in 1861, where he joined the Texas militia. Eventually, he would end up leading the 1st Texas Cavalry Regiment, taking them into battle, where in 1864, during the Battle of Pleasant Hill, he would be mortally wounded and die 4 days later in nearby town in Louisiana. Several decades after his death, there was supposed to be a county in Texas named Buchel County after him, but this never materialized, and you can see where this county would have been if this had been brought forward. So for most Germans fighting for the Confederacy, the most famous ones are these aristocrats that came over particularly from areas of Prussia to fight in the cavalry. There were, of course, others who had emigrated certainly to places like Texas and some other smaller German communities, but generally their stories are less well known, and they didn't really serve in ethnic German units, they served interspersed in other units too. However, there were quite a lot of Germans living in the South who ideologically opposed the South's mission. This was particularly true for those Germans living in Texas, the Texas Germans, who several decades earlier had created a significant community in different parts of the state. As mentioned, because of their ideological background, they were often opposed to the South. This meant that they were largely distrusted, and many in the South thought they may form a kind of fifth column. This came to a head in 1862 when the Confederacy needed to draft men, and several Texas Germans decided to try to escape with their people to Mexico across the border. They made out across the desert, but then they were caught up by a Confederate militia, and depending on which version of what happens next, either the Nueces Massacre or the Nueces Battle took place. In any case, only 2 of the Confederate militiamen would be killed, whereas anywhere from 37 to 30 to 19 of the Texas Germans who were attempting to flee were killed in the ensuing firefight and the ensuing pursuit across the desert for several days. They were remembered in the North as being martyrs for the Union cause, as they had resisted joining the Southern Army for a cause they disagreed with. And actually, those that did get away, several of those would go on to form and join the Texas Cavalry that would fight on the Union side following the Union seizure of New Orleans in Louisiana. A monument was actually resurrected for the dead, or erected rather, they didn't sort of make a zombie army out of the dead, for those who had been killed in the Nueces battle, called the Treue der Union, so looking at that loyalty to the Union. It might also be interesting to note the sort of Prussian role in fighting techniques and how Prussians were engaged with the American Civil War as a way to learn lessons of warfare. The McClellan saddle, which was developed by General McClellan, was based on the Prussian saddle that was used by their cavalry. And indeed, the South would also go on to have a slightly different version of the saddle that they used. The Prussians were actively interested in following the developments of the American Civil War and sent Justus Scheibert as a specific correspondent and observer of the war so that they could learn particular lessons about modern warfare in the United States. Much has been made about what the Prussians actually thought of the American Civil War, and there is a quote that's attributed to Helmut von Moltke, one of these very important generals, Prussian generals, that said of the American Civil War in general, but particularly about Sherman's campaign in Georgia, that it was like 2 armed mobs chasing each other around the country, and allegedly he also called Sherman an ass. This has been brought into question, however, and Sherman doesn't seem to think that Moltke actually said this, saying later on, "Moltke was never fool enough to say that. I have seen Moltke in person. I did not presume to ask him the question because I did not presume he was such an ass to say that. The Prussian army learned many a lesson and profited from them by our war, and their officers were prompt to acknowledge it." Well, Sherman doesn't think that Moltke said this, and indeed I haven't been able to track down any kind of accurate quote of Moltke's when he would have said this. It does seem that most of the Prussian observers of the American Civil War weren't too impressed with what they saw. I mean, there's a source attributed to Baron von Massau, who I mentioned at the beginning, with his ostrich feather plume riding off into battle, about the difference between Prussian and American tactics. He, so that is von Massau, was riding by the side of Captain William Chapman on a midnight raid into the heart of a cavalry camp near Fairfax Courthouse, which was surrounded by thousands of Union soldiers. In a whisper, Chapman explained to the Baron what they were doing and how to do it artistically, incidentally stressing the boldness and danger. The Baron proved an apt pupil, but after a time whispered very quietly to Chapman, "This isn't fighting, this is horse stealing." This is the case that from 1864, the Prussians would win the Dano-Prussian War. In 1866, they would defeat the Austrians in the Austro-Prussian War. And in 1871, they would defeat the French in the Franco-Prussian War, resulting in the creation of a German empire. These were so-called short wars, not the grinding kind of campaigns that were seen in the American Civil War, where towards the end, Union thrusts were made into Confederate territory in an attempt to destroy the means of waging war. In this case, it was army against army with short, decisive encounters that sealed the deal. There's an interesting PhD project that's been done about this, which I'll link in the description below. It's open access to read, which is why the German states didn't actually think too highly of the American Civil War and why they didn't go on to use certain lessons that had been learned in the American Civil War in their own military strategic planning. In the end of his PhD, the Brigadier General Kai Brinkmann concludes, "The US Civil War at its time produced a number of lessons which the Germans did not recognize. Many of these lessons the German army had to learn through its own experience, costing valuable lives and eventually leading to a fatal war, World War I." Anyway, I thought that was more than enough to finish off this video about Germans in the American Civil War. So let me know in the comments below, did you enjoy this video? Did you already know about some of the characters that I mentioned in this video and what they got up to in the American Civil War? Let me know what other nations, nationalities, groups would you like me to look at during the American Civil War, perhaps something on various Native American groups, nations, why they joined one side or the other, or what their role was would be interesting, or maybe some more about the history of various other linguistic communities in the United States. Still got to return to looking at some of the Frisian speaking areas in the United States, which I started with Friesland, Wisconsin, so let me know if you'd like to see anything about that. Anyway, any interesting information on this topic in the description below. I always try and read the comments, so I'd be interested to see what you have. Anyway, until the next time, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History. Auf Wiedersehen.